Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this episode, I am talking with the designer, the writer, and critic Bryn Smith. Bryn is a graduate of SVA's design criticism program and has written for publications like Core 77, Designers and Books, and the AIGA blog Eye on Design. She also recently co-wrote the excellent book 20 over 80 and teaches in the graduate program at RISD. I met up with Bryn back in August at SVA in New York, where we talked about what it's like to get an MFA in design criticism. And then we also talk about the role of a design critic in major publications and how to write about design for general audiences. And then finally, how to use designed artifacts to talk about larger cultural issues. So this is a fun and wide-ranging conversation, and having studied at SVA, Bryn brings a sort of different approach to criticism that was really great to learn about and to talk with her about. So thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoy this fun conversation with Bryn Smith. I wanted to actually, kind of going off of that, I wanted to start with you with kind of what your background is, because I actually don't really know how you got into this at all.
Yeah.
And so kind of what was your kind of story?
So the sort of which came first, design or writing, is an interesting question. I think in some ways writing came first and then design, and then the two sort of merged. When I was younger, junior high, high school age, I was a pretty strong writer, and I did a lot of creative writing and that kind of thing. And I feel like I used to think I wanted to be a journalist. But I also was really interested in design or graphic design, but I didn't know, similar to what you were saying, I didn't know what that was.
Yeah, so this is high school?
It's high school, junior high school probably. Okay. My mom used to buy me, my mom is, my parents are both creative. My dad works with computers, and he's retired now, in finance to some degree. And my mom, is a textile artist, does a lot of sort of different things. We did a lot of crafts growing up, that sort of thing. And she used to, I don't really remember how it started, but she used to buy me communication arts, and I used to look at it and try to figure things. I really liked looking at it, and those sorts of other types of, we had art magazines and things around. And so that made me think that I was interested in writing and journalism, but then that made me think I was also interested in advertising.
Right.
So when I went to college, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I ended up majoring in journalism with a focus in advertising, but the more I learned about advertising, the less excited I was about advertising. And I ended up not going, I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder.
Okay.
For a lot of different reasons, but it was sort of strange. I studied journalism and advertising, but as I said, the more I learned about advertising, the less I wanted to be in it.
But so you were studying both because you didn't know, you were interested in both and you didn't know what kind of direction you wanted to go in?
Yeah, to some degree. I think at that point I didn't necessarily want to be a writer. I wanted to do something creative.
Right.
And I was also I was doing a certificate in, at that time it was called Technology, Arts, and Media. So it was learning Flash, and then taking color theory, and then taking these sort of, looking back on it, these, ad classes where you're writing copy and pitching commercials that are terrible. But then I studied abroad my senior year, and I kind of missed the portfolio portion of school. And when I came back, I ended up taking a class with an adjunct professor who was a graphic designer. And then I was graphic design. I mean, I think I had already been kind of figuring it out. But then I was graphic design is the thing I want to do. And so then after that, I moved to New York, started working as a graphic designer,
Okay.
as a freelancer, just on my, like started as an intern working for a design studio that did work for nonprofit clients, started getting other like freelance jobs. I did a lot of like, the beginning I did a lot of like production and pre-press work.
Right.
Fast forward like 10 or so years, I was feeling really stuck as a designer. Like I kind of had my own business, but I was doing a lot of freelance work and doing a lot of like on-site production work, feeling kind of unfulfilled, and also remembering that I had this passion for writing.
And so during that time, were you doing any writing
No,
at all, or
no,
was
not
like
really.
you were just a designer at that
Yeah,
point?
I was just like a straight up graphic designer,
Interesting.
self-taught, because I had sort of studied.
Yeah.
Like I said, some of those formal things in college, but I didn't go to art school. I learned on the job when I was here, and then, I don't think I was really doing any kind of writing, and then I was thinking about going to grad school because I was sort of ready for like a change, and then it was this decision of, do I like go to Cranbrook and figure out how to like turn what I've been doing into like a more like personal driven practice, or do I go into writing? And then I discovered the design criticism program here at SVA, and I was like, oh, this is all of those things in one.
So you were thinking, part of you was like, you were thinking that you might abandon design, or what were you thinking of kind of the Cranbrook or writing? Was that writing about, were you thinking about writing about design at that time?
I think I was. I mean, it's a good question. I guess I've never really like unpacked it. I think I think I was really torn in terms of, I wanted to do more writing, or I thought that was maybe more of a good like a long-term way to expand my practice. So I was still thinking like I would be a graphic designer, but that I would also write in some capacity. I think if I had gone like the Cranbrook route, that would have been more straight design work. And I think I guess what I was trying to say is I also think I was really torn in terms of like what's like a pure thing to do as a designer. And I think if I was being really honest, I probably at the time would have been like, Cranbrook seems like the thing, like right thing, but it actually wasn't the right thing for me.
So you found the Decrypt program, and that was like, oh, this combines these both things that I was interested in. And was that kind of like an immediate, this is the thing that I want to do?
Yeah, it was. I remember like flipping through the catalog and seeing like the pictures of the I think it was the first year that they had it, because I can't remember. I think my class was either the third or the fourth year. But I remember being like, oh, this is both like I can have everything if I do this. I can still be a designer, and I can learn how to write about design, and I can kind of expand what I'm doing. But it kind of made sense in that way. Like it was combining the writing background with the design practice that I had been doing into one thing.
What was that kind of experience like, actually being in those classes and going through that program?
I think it was interesting. I mean, I think it really broadened my understanding of design. Again, I hadn't really studied it formally, so in some ways, I had been practicing for a long time, so I felt sort of ahead in that realm. Like I had 10 years under my belt as a professional designer, so I felt like I knew how to make work and do that sort of thing. But like we had a really amazing design history course, and all of that was completely new to me. Like I didn't really know that much about industrial design. I knew things about architecture, but I hadn't like studied it formally. So like Alexander Lang's class, where going out and into the city and then reviewing buildings, like those sorts of things. All that was really eye-opening and sort of and really nice. It was also really good for me because it's sort of interesting. One of the I don't want to say flaws of the program, but maybe there wasn't as much of a focus on graphic design, actually.
Oh, it was like design and like the broadest.
Yeah, and we definitely looked at like industrial design, architecture, and kind of a lot of different facets, cities and urbanism, but graphic design wasn't actually as much of a focus. It was really good. I felt like I needed a break from that, and so I kind of got that. And then I actually ended up bringing it kind of back in with my thesis work anyway. But it was sort of a nice change in that sense.
And before that, had you ever, I know you said that you kind of had like stopped writing, but was this kind of your first time writing about design, or like actually seeing those kind of two separate interests that you had kind of like come together?
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, I think like when I was thinking back to when I applied, I think I had to submit a writing sample, and I dug up like a paper I had written when I studied abroad in college. Like I didn't have like any kind of clips or like anything. I wasn't like, I didn't have a blog. I wasn't really doing any kind of writing before the program.
And how did I don't know how to phrase this question exactly, but like how did kind of going through that program and from the way it sounds like thinking about design in kind of like different ways than you had been working, how did that change? Did that change at all how you thought about like the design work that you had done and were doing?
Yeah, I think in some sense. I mean, I think I think in some senses it sort of goes back to that like opening of like what design is. I think at the time I was going back to school or thinking about going back to school, graphic design felt like this really small world. I had a lot of friends who were in illustration. I had a studio and I worked with all these sort of different people. But there was a sort of like cult of personality in terms of the people who were well known or like the people that you already knew of, the like Sagmeisters or the those sorts of bigger name people. And it seemed like this really small inclusive club. There was no way, even though like, again, I had a lot of experience, there was no way I was gonna like start teaching or start writing or feel confident in doing those things. And I think when I got to Decrit and started expanding and like understanding design from like a different point of view, it just like exploded the world and also made me think like, oh, okay, like the graphic design is really small, or these worlds are really small, but they're all kind of related. And there's kind of different ways in there's not like one way to do it.
This is probably a bad question, and it might be like a little bit of a trick question, and I don't mean it that way, but like when you and I might be like projecting this onto you also, but it sounds like, and this also could just be how I kind of like came to learn about you and your work, and like a narrative that I've kind of put on you, but and hearing this, it sounds like you kind of went into the program seeing yourself as a designer. When you kind of graduated from that, did you see yourself more as a writer or as a designer, or like how did you kind of wrestle with those kind of two things?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was thinking about that earlier as I was thinking about this conversation, because I think when I graduated and for a while and maybe even still, I was still like, I'm a graphic designer, and because I think that like titling is actually really interesting. And the way that you like phrase your bio and how you kind of write it for different audiences. But now I don't know. Now I feel like I'm shifting into this phase of my career where I am doing more writing and editing. So it feels harder to be, like I feel like in the last 6 months I've had to sort of change when I'm introducing myself. At the same time, I'm very interested in like still kind of claiming graphic design, like being a graphic designer who does writing and editing, and that's not like a separate identity. And it's something that like I tell my students at RISD too. Like I think it's sort of one thing, but I find myself, even like I'm saying, even now sort of shifting to, okay, but I'm doing like the majority of my time right now is spent writing and editing. So therefore, like what does that make me? So I think right away I was still like, I'm a graphic designer / critic /
They're like hyphenated
trail of
title.
things, or even like I feel like for a while I could still say like I'm a graphic designer full stop, and it encapsulates these things.
Yeah.
Now it's kind of getting a little blurrier.
Well, when I talked to Michael Rock, and I've heard him say this in other interviews also, but he has this phrase where he says that design is just an elaborate form of writing, and it's the same type of process. You just have more tools or materials that you use.
Yeah.
Which strangely kind of feels like a good definition for me in a lot of ways. But I'm kind of curious now is like how those two activities relate to each other now that you are doing more quote unquote writing and editing.
Yeah.
How do you think about that as like a design process, or how does that, change how you think of yourself as a designer, if at all?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that. I mean, I think what you said is true, that the process is really similar, and I think there's sort of a strange thing that happens too when you end up like on the other side of a meeting where there's designers and writers and and I think it's sort of in some ways it's sort of a refreshing change, but I think in like, I don't know, it's a tough question to answer. I think like in terms of like job definition, when you're like working on a project, it's very clear that of course you're influencing one another and you're commenting on the design work and things. But I don't know. I think I'm in a period of like figuring that out. Because I don't right now, at least, like in terms of, like I said, I think I'm shifting to this period of like doing more writing and editing. And I think I would hope that the next phase would sort of remerge again.
Right.
But right now, like I'm not doing a lot of other design.
How does your design background shape how you think about editing?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, it does. It's one of these things where I feel like it, of course, like it's your background, so it informs everything that you do. I don't know that I.
Do you think that you bring something as an editor with a design background than an editor who doesn't have a design background? I guess is kind of the question.
Yeah. I think it's tricky. I mean, I think in some senses it kind of depends on the project and the people you're working with. I think in some ways it's sort of that thing I was talking about where you're in school, or when I was in school, where you have to kind of take yourself out of the equation of the design project part of it. So there's that, but then in other ways, I think there's like a level of knowledge and understanding of like how the design process works, where you can actually be like a better collaborator and facilitator.
That's interesting.
But I think it kind of depends on the project.
Yeah.
I wish I had a more like robust statement in terms of like how I approach
it.
But I think it kind
that's
of
interesting. Yeah, I wanna talk about criticism a little bit and design criticism. And I have kind of a couple questions kind of related to that, and I think you have compared to the other people I've talked to, you have an interesting kind of point of view on this, in that you actually studied in a program that was called design criticism. And so I guess like just very simply, like how do you think of what is the role of design criticism, and how do you kind of think about that as an activity?
Right. I think the role of criticism often is to illuminate design, or the different sort of, or design criticism more specifically. I think it acts to illuminate the design process for people who aren't designers. So a lot of it is sort of, to me anyway, I think, and the things I took away and really enjoyed about the program was this idea that you can sort of like broaden the conversation around design, where it doesn't become so insular, but there is actually more of like an exchange and a dialogue between, I don't necessarily even just mean like the general public, like talking down to them, explaining what design is, but actually like including them in the conversation, and also including other designers in a way to like facilitate some sort of conversation.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question. This is something that's come up with a lot of the people that I've talked to, and it's been something that I've been thinking about a lot, is when you talk about design criticism or writing about design, the kind of inevitable next question is, who is that writing for?
Yeah.
And there's like definitely a split, whether that split needs to be there or not. It's there of, are you writing for the profession and for practitioners, or is this writing for the general public?
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of curious, like, how do you think about that? Like, do you kind of see that split, or like kind of how do you think about audience and things like that?
Yeah, I think again, sometimes it depends on like what the project is, because I think,
like, do you see a value in having kind of like a rich discourse in criticism for non-designers, I guess?
I thought you were going to say designers.
I
yeah,
was
no,
going
I
to,
think
but
I do. I think in both ways. I mean, I think in the sense that you know, you could say that design is becoming much more widely understood
yeah,
by a greater number of people.
uh-huh.
There's less of a barrier to understanding even kind of what it is. I think like I think there's less people growing up thinking, what is this strange thing I'm interested in?
Yeah.
And then not knowing what that is until they're in college.
Right.
But I don't know, that's probably
Yeah.
still happening. But I also think there's this like hunger and desire for discourse and criticism within design more specifically, and graphic design even more specifically, in that what often happens is you have kind of side conversations or conversations with students or conversations with other practitioners, and there's a lot of like interest and feeling around things that are happening in the design world, but no one really wants to kind of go there or write about it or like rock the boat. And I think that's the kind of stuff that's actually really interesting and challenging.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because this is something that's come up in probably every interview that I've done, and I was starting to think that like maybe this is like some kind of like insecurity that I have, and maybe I'm the person kind of like bringing it up. And so I'm glad that like you started this, because something that's come up in all of them is this kind of idea of like the hot take or the kind of social media instant reaction to either like a rebrand or some new kind of, you know, whatever like the hot design issue is.
Yeah.
And are those types, because those types of conversations are happening, are there not kind of like what you're saying, like a richer kind of like deeper investigation or questioning about what this stuff means for the larger profession, but then also for the larger audience?
Yeah. I don't know that I would connect the two. Like, I don't know that it's happening or not happening because it's happening on social media, although I think that's 100% true. And if those conversations, I think those conversations can be valuable even as they're the opposite of that sometimes. But I do think there's still like a desire for like, there's just not people writing, there's just not people doing it, myself included, because writing takes a lot of time and energy and effort, and I don't know, there's that sort of cyclical thing of everyone should write more, and we need to have more practitioners who are writing, and this crisis of where's the criticism?
Right. I mean, and that's kind of like, that's something that this is starting to get a little bit meta commentary on what I hope this project becomes, but like that's something that like I don't want this to be. I hope that whatever I kind of like make out of this project, and what I don't want like these interviews to be, where is the design criticism? Like, we need more people talking about design, because like I don't know if I actually like believe that, because I do think that there are more people talking about design than ever before. And so like I agree with you 100%, and I just wonder, I think like the question that I have is kind of like the question like behind that question, which is, sure, it would be great if more people were writing about design, more practitioners were writing about their process and the work that they do. But then like what is the value that adds? Like, is that just is that just for other designers to kind of like, you know, talk about? Is there some kind of larger value that adds? When I talked to Koi Vin, we talked about like that kind of stereotypical Medium post, which is kind of prevalent in like Silicon Valley culture of like their writing, and has the kind of front of criticism or some sort of critical idea, but it's also kind of self-promotional for their startup and things like that. And it's just like
that's where I think that bridge to the broader audience gets really interesting, because I think something we used to talk about when I was in school was, you know, you have an architecture critic, you have a movie critic, and you have theater critic, but like where's the design critic?
Right.
And in some places that person does exist, but just that could be kind of like another facet that is just a given. That kind of have those conversations that are happening like around practice or in that kind of insular way could seep into those sort of broader conversations, and there could be some sort of forum. I don't know if that answers the question. But
no. Do you think that that's something that's needed, or like that there is a good that comes out of, you know, the New York Times having a staff writer who is a design critic?
Sure.
Okay.
What is that value? Is that the next question?
Sure. Yeah.
Or what were you going to say?
I was going to say what do they write about? What are the issues that a design critic writes about?
That's a good question. I mean, I think they could write about typography. I think they could write about. I mean, it's hard because I think in some sense, my training, like in that sort of design, can be all these different things, broadens into like architecture, urbanism, and like there is an architecture critic, so like that like you're saying, like that's kind of taken care of. So what does that other person write about? Like I think there's someone at the it's either the Times or New York Mag who is a cultural critic and writes a lot about music and film and fashion and all these sorts of things. I actually think, in some ways, I think it could be someone writing about that logo that blew up on Twitter and everyone's, but like getting to the bottom of that in a way that's not just like regurgitating that conversation, but actually having a conversation about what that conversation means in design. Because that's more interesting. And I think some of those pieces are being written and talked about. But if there was someone who was like on that beat, who could kind of investigate those things when they flare up, I think could be interesting.
Do you think this is probably a bit of an unfair question, but do you think that type of person needs to come from the design profession, or should that be a person who isn't trained as a designer?
Yeah.
Or does that even matter? Like I don't
know if it matters. I mean, I think in some sense, we used to debate this sometimes because I think Rick Pointer would always come up in this sort of conversation, in that he's not trained. He didn't train as a designer, but then writes about design. Or you have people like the architecture critic Paul Goldberger, who famously says, like, I was a terrible architect, so I became a critic. I don't think it has to be that black and white. Like I think as long as that person, I think in some sense it's nice to have the design background, because you're able to understand things maybe a little more specifically, as long as you kind of bridge that gap to like not have to explain things from like a very rudimentary level every time. At the same time, I could see the flip side of being like someone from an outsider perspective writing about these issues could be interesting too. But I guess I kind of land more on I think someone with a design background or who studied design in some way would have a better take.
I'm thinking about, I don't mean for this to like sound like a debate, But I'm thinking about like people like I went to a panel. I watched a panel a couple weeks ago in Brooklyn with A.O. Scott, Emily Nussbaum, and Wesley Morris, and somebody else whose name just slipped my mind, talking about criticism. And
I think Wesley Morris is actually the critic that I was talking about. I think, isn't he?
He's at New York Times.
He's at New York Times. What is his?
Mostly like movies and like TV.
Okay.
Anyway. He's, if you don't know him, you should read him. He's probably one of my all-time favorite kind of critics writing today. And it's actually good because I kind of wanted to talk about the way I think about his writing is, and I think Emily Nussbaum does this also in, they've never made a movie, they've never, made a TV show, which is fine. But what I think is interesting about their writing is that they kind of use the artifact of the movie or the artifact of a 30-minute television episode to talk about some larger cultural issue.
Yeah.
So like Wesley Morris, for example, deals a lot with race and kind of identity politics and things like that. But at the core, there's all these like kind of pop culture touchstones that he uses.
Yeah.
To kind of say like, oh, look at all these kind of questions about race right now, or all these questions about identity and sexuality, but using those things as kind of like his starting point or like his way into those things. And I don't know, I think there's something to graphic design that kind of has the ability to do that also because it is so kind of embedded in the larger culture.
Sure, yeah.
Could design criticism be this thing that is, equal parts about typography, but also about politics and the world and things like that?
Yeah, 100%. I think that's sort of where I was trying to get to with the like conversation about the social media thing. And now that you've talked more about Wesley Morris, that is who I was talking about. Because I think it's more accessible and it's like a larger conversation, and I think the sort of circular argument or problem that design criticism or like that kind of graphic design conversation always gets into is that just like insularity, and so that breaks it up. Once you start connecting it to these larger themes, then you start trying to connect it to things that are actually happening and people can kind of resonate with people more. I think you can make those connections, and that conversation is really interesting, maybe more so than the specifics of sans serif or something.
Yeah, and like I don't know, and that's like kind of my always question is it because I'm so kind of like embedded in this world and I'm trained as a designer, and so like I understand typography and stuff, that if I read about design, I don't want to read about the typography as much unless there's some kind of like deeper thing behind it. And I don't know, it feels like there's more that can we talk about around the artifacts, which I think is interesting.
I think that's definitely true, and I think similarly, I think the things that I get excited writing about, I was writing a column for a while for EIGA IN Design about design in the wild, like things that were happening in the everyday, which I find much more like interesting and even for myself than like critiquing a new typeface or something. So I think that kind of connection to how it's used, how people are actually interacting with it, and sort of that larger conversation is.
I have just a couple of questions just to kind of like wrap it up a little bit. Who is doing the most interesting design writing in your mind, or who are writers about design that you are drawn to at the moment?
Alexandra Lang, of course, who you've already talked to. She was a teacher of mine at Decrit, and I think I've always been really, really interested in the way that she writes about spaces and describes things, and so kind of visual and on the ground. I really love that kind of reporting. Carrie Jacobs, who's another one of my teachers, and actually maybe someone else that would be really interesting to talk to. She, again, is someone who sort of situates themselves like within a space or really connects to like the experience of whether it be like a building or I worked on Design for People, and she wrote the introduction to that book. And she came to the studio and kind of embedded herself in Scott Stoll's studio and sort of told the story like from the inside out that way, which was and actually I think to give Chapo credit, I think it was her idea to sort of to think about her writing the essay in the way where it's like she's like visiting a building or like going on location kind of.
That's interesting.
And not that would have happened otherwise, but I thought it was just an interesting way to kind of think about an essay.
I want to, I guess now that it's kind of more of your job, do you write every day?
In some capacity, yes, I do write every day. I don't, but little sort of small things, and of course lots of like really banal like emails and tweets, that sort of thing. I think like longer editorial pieces, that sort of thing, are still quite spread out. And for me, challenging, I think, as I said before, I think writing sort of a love-hate relationship. It's just so time-consuming.
Right.
And I always find I have to sort of like ramp up to like really write something if I'm trying to commit to it. So I do write every day, but not maybe in the way that the kind of writing that you're describing. Like I wish I was getting up and writing for an hour, before work or something. Not really feasible, but.
I just want to end talking a little bit about your new book. I feel like it's interesting. I haven't read it yet, but I've flipped through it in a bookstore, and I think the concept is interesting, and just I feel like we can kind of like talk about that a little bit. And it's kind of tangentially related to kind of all this stuff we've been talking about a little bit, and to this, what I hope this project becomes also. So kind of what were the origins of that? Where did that kind of come about?
Yeah, so the book is 20 over 80 conversations.
I didn't want to say it because I never remember if it's 20, 30, or 40. Like in my mind, I every time I give a different number of like the 20 number. So it's 20.
It's 20 over 80. So obviously sort of a play on sort of emphasis on the new, young, emerging, and sort of flipping that a bit. I came into the project a little bit late. Eileen Kwan, who also came through this SVA Decrypt program, started working on the book with the Princeton Architectural Press, and then brought me in to work on it with her because I had been doing a lot of interviewing, and our interests were sort of aligned in that sense. So we started working on it together. But basically, it's a book of 20 profiles of sort of legendary designers, architects over the age of 80. So we spent a long time.
It's a great idea too. Like I'm surprised no one had done. It's one of those where it's like, oh, how has no one done this before?
Right. Yeah, and I think there've been little panels or things here and there. I believe that Steve Heller had actually done a panel at some point that tied in somehow. But yeah, we did these profiles with these sort of 20 people, everyone from Ricardo Scofidio to Denise Scott Brown, Milton Glaser, a wide range of people and sort of practices.
And so what was that you were kind of interviewing? Was like that kind of your main role in that? Were you?
We did. So Eileen and I did everything from determining who we were going to interview to interviewing them to editing. We had an editor, of course, that we worked with at Princeton. But yeah, we basically put the book together, and then we worked with a designer there. But we started out doing kind of longer interviews, like these sort of epic, long interviews, which I'm sure as you've been doing more interviewing, you realize like short and sweet is kind of great. We sort of had sort of topics and things that we came back to for everyone, but we had different sets of questions. We do tons of research beforehand before we talk to people, and then kind of try to tailor each interview to that person, because we were really interested in sort of the historical aspects of this generation kind of coming of age in the 1950s, and sort of how technology has changed and how their careers had changed, and just sort of emergent themes like across those generations. And then we kind of divvied in some sense where one person would kind of take on. We did a few of them together, but then we kind of split up and would kind of take them on separately.
And it's kind of been well received.
It's been well received. Yeah, people are really into it. We've done a few. We did a panel at the Strand. And then 92nd Street Y, and we might be doing another event this fall that we're trying to figure out. But it's been really rewarding and nice to see that people are interested in it. And I think, I think there's a good mix of people who everyone knows, and then people who are maybe less well known too. So I think that's been really nice. But yeah, it's sort of this weird thing where we worked on it for I think almost 3 years, and so it's sort of this strange out of body experience for it to be a printed book that you can pick up. And,
that's great.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
I'm excited to buy it and actually read it cover to cover, because the bits that I have seen I've loved.
Great, thanks.
And thank you for talking to me. This was great.
You're very welcome.
This episode was recorded on August 10th, 2016 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.